There is a common misconception that schizophrenia is not curable, but this is false. In this video, I'm going to explain exactly how and why schizophrenia can be cured. A common misconception is that schizophrenia is a disease that once you're diagnosed with it, you have it for life. There's nothing that could ever change that. And at most that you could hope for is to take antipsychotics and hopefully go into remission. Now, I'm not trying to say that schizophrenia is always curable, but I am going to say this. In at least 21% of cases, and as many as 70 or 75% of cases are in fact curable. So probably around at least 50% of cases of schizophrenia are curable as long as you do it right. Now, what I mean by curable is you can either not take the medications or discontinue the medications and never again have the symptoms that make you schizophrenic for the rest of your life. In other words, someone who previously fit the criteria for being diagnosed with schizophrenia would be able to go for their entire lives without fitting the criteria for being diagnosed with schizophrenia ever again and not having to take antipsychotic medications ever again. I'd like to start out with a quote from psychiatrist E. Fuller Torrey. Now, the reason why I am quoting E. Fuller Torrey is not necessarily because I agree with him or because I agree with a lot of what he says, but because he is actually a very pro-medication extremist. He believes in coerced psychiatric treatment. We already have coerced psychiatric treatment, but E. Fuller Torrey thinks that the abilities of the government to force people into psychiatric treatment should be greatly expanded. He even thinks that people should not be allowed to go outside barefoot in the wintertime, and that if they do that, the government should intervene. He very reluctantly acknowledges that at least some of the time, schizophrenia does go away to the point where the person does not need to take medications for the rest of their lives. In an article for the Psychiatric Times, he wrote, "It has been known for a century that some individuals with schizophrenia recover and do not need ongoing treatment. As early as 1939, Dr. Harry Stalker at the University of Edinburgh published outcome data on 3,551 patients with schizophrenia. He reported that 21% of them were in complete remission or social remission, and another 5% had improved and were living at home." It should be noted that in 1939, when this study was published, no antipsychotic medications existed. The first antipsychotic medication came out in the 1950s, and it was Thorazine. So these people did not improve because of an antipsychotic, since antipsychotics didn't exist. I actually looked at this study myself. It's published in the British Journal of Psychiatry, and interestingly, none of the people in this study received any form of treatment for schizophrenia at all. They didn't receive any form of convulsive therapy either. So all of these people recovered completely from schizophrenia to the point where their symptoms never came back in spite of not receiving any treatment for schizophrenia whatsoever. So even though people like Dr. Torrey do acknowledge that some people are cured of schizophrenia, that in many cases, schizophrenia does go away permanently without any need for any sort of treatment, he does not emphasize the fact that most people don't realize this. Most people believe that schizophrenia is either incurable or that if it is curable, maybe it's only happened to like 1 or 2 people or something like that. But if 21% of the time schizophrenia goes away on its own forever and people are able to completely recover and be cured of it, then that means that schizophrenia is far from being incurable. In fact, 21% of the people with schizophrenia can be cured simply by allowing it to go away on its own completely. However, there are people that, in addition to the 21%, that can also be cured who may need some medication temporarily. Now, a lot of people seem to think that I'm opposed to antipsychotic medication. It is true that antipsychotics are, in fact, some of the most dangerous types of psychiatric medications, and one of them, clozapine, which is the most powerful antipsychotic, is probably the most dangerous psychiatric medication ever created. But I'm not always opposed to using antipsychotics, and for one thing, I will give them praise. When it comes to antidepressants, if an antidepressant can manage to reduce your symptoms of depression by 10%, then it's considered a big success. Antipsychotics, on the other hand, are much more likely to be successful. Now, I want to point out that antipsychotics are called antipsychotics. They're not called anti-schizophrenics. And I want to point out that there are two types of symptoms of schizophrenia that are considered psychotic symptoms. One type is hallucinations, and the other type is delusions. Sometimes a third type of schizophrenic symptom, known as disorganized speech, is considered a psychotic symptom. However, sometimes disorganized speech is categorized as a cognitive symptom and not a psychotic symptom. Then there are negative symptoms of schizophrenia. Negative symptoms of schizophrenia include loss or lack of motivation, inability to feel pleasure, and flattened emotions. But the thing is, all antipsychotics work by antagonizing dopamine, at least to some extent. All of them antagonize the D2 dopamine receptors, and many of them antagonize other dopamine receptors. Technically, there are a few newer generation antipsychotics like Abilify that work as partial agonists at the dopamine D2 receptors, but partial agonists are actually competitive antagonists. So all antipsychotics actually antagonize dopamine. Now, you might have heard that things like being highly motivated is linked to high amounts of dopamine. Well, then it makes sense that things like antipsychotics, which actually block dopamine, will make things like lacking motivation worse. So I want to point out that all of the negative symptoms of schizophrenia are actually made worse by antipsychotics. Another type of negative symptom, and this is one of the most rare types of symptoms, is catatonia. People who are catatonic often don't move at all for many, many, many hours, and I think that someday they may regard catatonia as a separate disorder from schizophrenia. At one time, all the way until 1980, they regarded autism as a type of schizophrenia, and then, like I said, in 1980, they decided that it was a separate disorder. When catatonia was first discovered, catatonia was considered a separate disorder from schizophrenia. Then they decided it was a type of schizophrenia, but someday they may decide that it's not really a type of schizophrenia at all. And anyway, catatonia is a very rare form of schizophrenia. It's a very rare symptom of schizophrenia. And it's unquestionably true that antipsychotics don't help with catatonia either. If anything, antipsychotics make catatonia worse. Catatonia is usually treated with things like benzodiazepines, but antipsychotics are not going to help catatonia. What antipsychotics can help is delusions and hallucinations. When it comes to things like delusions and hallucinations, antipsychotics are quite successful. In fact, after 6 months of usage, about 70% of people who are taking antipsychotic medications, and these include medications like Geodon, Abilify, Zyprexa, and others, about 70% will have all of their positive symptoms, also known as the psychotic symptoms, and sometimes the positive symptoms also include disorganized speech, completely go away. And after 1 year of usage on antipsychotic medications, 80% of patients will have all of their symptoms, or the psychotic symptoms, completely go away. So they're much more successful than antidepressants at eliminating psychosis. The American Psychiatric Association has guidelines for discontinuing antipsychotics. If it's true that schizophrenia is incurable, which it's not, then the American Psychiatric Association would not have this guideline. But the American Psychiatric Association says that if you've been on antipsychotics and you've been free of positive symptoms for a year, then the clinician should consider discontinuing antipsychotics. Now, I have no problem if you want to do this with your psychiatrist. But do keep in mind that if your psychiatrist tells you that it's impossible for anybody to discontinue their antipsychotics and not have their symptoms returned, realize that he's either wrong or they are lying to you. You may want to cite some of the research that I mentioned in this video, such as the study that E. Fuller-Torrey mentioned, and the fact that the American Psychiatric Association actually does have as its guideline that a clinician should consider discontinuing antipsychotics after a person has had their positive symptoms go away for a year. And like I said, things like negative symptoms will not improve with antipsychotics. So please don't let anybody tell you that they will, because they won't. According to research done by Martin Harrow, this is what happens when you discontinue the antipsychotics if you're schizophrenic. Within the first 6 to 10 months after discontinuation, 25 to 55% of schizophrenic patients discontinued from antipsychotics relapse. In contrast, relapse rates were considerably lower in discontinued schizophrenic patients who remained stable during these 6 to 10 months. So the flip side of that statistic is anywhere from 45% to 75% of schizophrenics within the first 6 to 10 months did not relapse, which means that it's possible that up to 75% of the time, schizophrenia is in fact curable. Because once you get to the 10-month mark, it's very unlikely that your schizophrenic symptoms will come back. By that I mean, if you are able to discontinue the antipsychotics and your positive symptoms don't come back, it's quite likely that they never will come back. After 5 years, it's impossible for them to come back. That's because there has only been a handful of recorded cases, like 5 or less, of people who have had schizophrenic symptoms and then took antipsychotics and they went away completely, and then discontinued antipsychotics and the symptoms came back after 5 years. If you have schizophrenia and you are able to get your schizophrenia to go away using antipsychotics, and then you were able to discontinue the antipsychotics for 5 years or longer, and you do not have any symptoms return, that means that your chances of the symptoms ever returning are 0. You are in fact cured. If you discontinue the antipsychotics and none of the symptoms return for at least 1 year, the chances of the symptoms ever returning are very, very, very low. You are most likely cured. So in summation, this is how you cure schizophrenia. And it's not possible for everyone, but it could be possible for anywhere from 21% to 75% of cases. If your schizophrenia goes away on its own, then you are cured. So if you have symptoms of schizophrenia, you can wait about a year and see if the symptoms go away. If they do go away, then they will likely never come back. The other thing you can do is, if after 1 year the symptoms persist, you can try starting antipsychotics, such as Geodon or Abilify or some other antipsychotic. All of them are about equally as effective, except for clozapine, which is much more effective, but also much more dangerous. Wait for these drugs to cause all of your hallucinations and delusions to go away. In other words, you shouldn't be hearing any voices or having any other type of hallucination or any other type of delusion at all. For 70% of the people taking antipsychotics, this will occur within 6 months. For 80%, it will occur within 1 year. Then, after going 1 year without any of these psychotic symptoms, like hallucinations and delusions, you can discontinue it. It is recommended that you discontinue it slowly. You should take at least a month to slowly reduce the dose of antipsychotics before you quit entirely. And you may want to take longer than a month, especially if you've been taking a higher dose of antipsychotics or if you've been taking antipsychotics for longer than 2 or 3 years. Be aware that it does become harder to cure schizophrenia if you stay on antipsychotics for too long, specifically if you stay on them for longer than 2 or 3 years. If you are on antipsychotics for less than 2 years, however, you do have a pretty good chance of being able to cure schizophrenia. You also should keep some antipsychotics on hand after you discontinue them. That's because if the voices, for example, do come back, it's best to start taking the antipsychotics again as quickly as possible, because that way the hallucinations will go away once again as quickly as possible. If you wait too long, it can take longer for the hallucinations to go away. So, are you a good candidate for attempting to cure schizophrenia? Well, for one thing, if you want to be able to cure schizophrenia, you should either be able to have your hallucinations and delusions go away completely on their own without any sort of treatment, or you should be able to have them go away completely on their own with the use of antipsychotic medications. Like I said, 80% of people taking antipsychotic medications can achieve this within 1 year, but if you're part of the 20% that cannot, it's not as likely that you'll be able to cure schizophrenia. For most males, the symptoms of schizophrenia start in between the ages of 18 to 25. For most females, the symptoms of schizophrenia start between the ages of 25 to 30, or some sources say early 30s. If you had schizophrenic symptoms that started at an older age than is normal for your gender, then it is more likely that you'll be able to cure schizophrenia. However, even if you had schizophrenic symptoms start when you were younger, it's not necessarily impossible to cure schizophrenia. Also, if you are female, it'll be easier, statistically speaking, to cure schizophrenia, but even males are able to cure schizophrenia. If you have had many, many, many episodes of schizophrenia before and you have always relapsed, then it's going to be less likely that you'll be able to cure schizophrenia. However, it is possible, even in these cases, to sometimes be able to cure it. That's because there are people who have had several episodes of schizophrenia and have eventually been able to go into remission for the rest of their lives without medication. On the other hand, it is true that it's less likely. If you have had just one episode of schizophrenia, then it is much more likely that you will be able to be rid of schizophrenia for the rest of your life. If you have had 2 episodes of schizophrenia, then it's still actually quite likely that you'll be able to rid yourself of schizophrenia for the rest of your life. But you have to take into consideration how much you're willing to risk having a psychotic episode once again. Now, the other thing you also have to take into consideration is just how much of a problem were your psychotic episodes. For a lot of people with schizophrenia, the biggest problem with hearing voices is that they get annoying. And in some cases, these voices can get extremely annoying, and it's definitely worth treatment. However, in those cases, it's probably not too big of a risk to have the voices come back, because at worst, the voices were just annoying. On the other hand, if there were other problems that the voices were causing you that were much worse, then you may not want to take this risk as much. But do keep in mind that the longer you take antipsychotic medications, the more likely you are to actually have a full-on relapse, even with the medications. As you can see from this chart, statistically speaking, people who have been on antipsychotics for more than 2 years are actually more likely to relapse than people who discontinue antipsychotics. Now, I do want to say that there are some people who are probably better off taking antipsychotics for the rest of their lives. And indeed, if you've been taking antipsychotics for decades, it becomes a lot harder to discontinue them because your brain becomes dependent upon them. One objection to this may be the theory that the duration of psychosis actually causes your brain to deteriorate, and therefore you should try to stay on antipsychotics, because if you go back to being psychotic, the brain will deteriorate more quickly. Well, here's the thing. The brain has never been proven to deteriorate when it is psychotic. In fact, all studies that say that duration of psychosis causes brain damage, in all of these studies, the people were also taking antipsychotic medications. And antipsychotic medications absolutely have been proven to cause brain damage. They absolutely have been proven to cause the brain to shrink. So in every study that claims to show that duration of psychosis could cause the brain to shrink, in all of these cases, the people were taking antipsychotic medications, and they failed to rule out the possibility that antipsychotic medications could be what is causing these people's brains to shrink, especially when you consider that antipsychotic medications absolutely have been proven to cause the brain to shrink themselves. So that's the thing, is that duration of psychosis probably is not really toxic to the brain, but antipsychotic medications are in fact toxic to the brain. I think that antipsychotic medications should be looked at as being somewhat similar to many chemotherapy medications. Chemotherapy medications, generally speaking, are usually poisonous to the body, but they are more poisonous to cancerous cells than non-cancerous cells, and that's why they are useful. Now, all of the antipsychotics have been proven to be neurotoxic. They all can cause things like tardive dyskinesia or other Parkinsonian side effects. They all can cause the brain to shrink. So these are proven neurotoxins, and perhaps the way they work to treat schizophrenia is that they slightly damage the brain, but in damaging the brain, they damage the part of the brain that causes psychosis. So these drugs should be treated as things that probably work by damaging your brain. But the fact is, they are effective, and they actually do deserve credit for often being able to not just treat schizophrenia, but actually being able to cure it. And like I said before, I have no problem if you want to do this with your psychiatrist. But do realize that the American Psychiatric Association actually recommends that people who are taking antipsychotics who have been symptom-free for a year, in their cases, the clinician should consider discontinuing the antipsychotic. So if it's always true that people are better off taking antipsychotics for the rest of their lives, then why would the American Psychiatric Association, in their guidelines, recommend that you at least consider taking people off of antipsychotic medications after they've been symptom-free for a year? Unfortunately, most psychiatrists will not even tell you about the possibility of discontinuing your antipsychotic medications, even if you're a first episode schizophrenic and you have been symptom-free with the antipsychotics for a year. And once again, by symptom-free, I mean that you're free of the hallucinations and the delusions. In other words, you're free of psychotic symptoms. Things like cognitive symptoms and negative symptoms will be made worse by antipsychotics. So, if you're someone who is not experiencing hallucinations or delusions, but you are experiencing negative symptoms, discontinuing antipsychotics can only cause negative symptoms to improve. If your psychiatrist tries to tell you that nobody has ever been able to have the symptoms of schizophrenia go away and not come back after discontinuing medication, then try to get a new psychiatrist, because he or she is either very misinformed or is lying to you. It's better to find a new psychiatrist that actually knows what they're talking about and that will actually tell you the truth. Because, like I said, research going back to the 1930s says that at least 21% of cases of schizophrenia will have all their symptoms go away for the rest of their lives without receiving any treatment whatsoever. And like I said, it's possible that with the use of antipsychotics temporarily, up to 75% of people who discontinue them will never have their symptoms return. Also, for first episode schizophrenics, there's no way to tell if they are one of the people that can discontinue their medications forever and not have their symptoms come back without actually discontinuing their medications. So, in many cases, schizophrenia actually is curable. Financially speaking, it's much more profitable for a psychiatrist to have a patient that has to keep coming back to them for the rest of their lives than it is to have a patient that they can cure and therefore doesn't have to keep coming back to them for the rest of their lives. Now, once again, I am not saying that it is always possible to cure schizophrenia, and indeed, in some cases, it's probably best to stay on the antipsychotics for the rest of your life. But the widespread belief that schizophrenia is uncurable and that everyone with schizophrenia is better off staying on medications for the rest of their lives is totally false. Ever since the 1930s, we've known that a significant number of people with schizophrenia will have their symptoms go away for the rest of their lives, even without any treatment. And more recently, we have found that an even higher percentage of people who take the antipsychotics temporarily and then discontinue them will have their symptoms go away permanently. This is why the American Psychiatric Association has in its guidelines that after 1 year of being symptom-free, or at least being free of psychotic symptoms while taking antipsychotics, that you should consider discontinuing the antipsychotics. They would not say that if it is always true that the person is better off taking antipsychotics for the rest of their lives. That's just false, and that's just a lie. In many cases, people are better off not taking the antipsychotics for the rest of their lives. Not in all cases, but in many cases, schizophrenia is in fact curable. If you'd like more mental health videos, then please let me know in the comments section and subscribe to my channel. I'm trying to get to 2,000 subscribers by April of 2018. I realize that that's a lofty goal, but it is in fact doable. For more information on this topic, you may want to watch my video, The Top 3 Most Dangerous Psychiatric Drugs. So if you like this video, go ahead and give it a like, and if you haven't already, subscribe to my channel, turn on notifications, and join the Zork Army. Together, we shall take over the world. I upload 7 or 8 videos a month on topics like mental health. You can also follow me on Snapchat, Instagram, and Twitter at ZorkMid123.